The Pharisee and the Tax Collector. Let's explore the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The story teaches us about the dangers of self-importance. Jesus warns that those who exalt themselves will be brought down, and the humble will be elevated in the eyes of the Lord. The On Fire Cafe presents the study of parables, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Luke 18:9-14. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For every one that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. The rituals. Prayer service traditions. It was usual for the people to go to the temple to pray twice a day. There was a morning and evening prayer service. At the time of the prayer, a rabbi would make a sacrifice unto the Lord, usually a small animal, something like a lamb or a calf. The burning of incense filling the temple with the scents, the sounding of trumpets in short bursts, praying aloud to the Lord, praising him and singing psalms. All these things in worship unto the Lord. Thumping the heart. An outward sign of humility in the Jewish culture was thumping the heart, or also referred to as beating the chest. One would strike the left side of the chest with the right fist. This symbolized thumping the heart. It was an expression of great emotion, a symbol of taking something into one's heart. It usually meant some form of extreme sorrow. The ritual was often used during confessions when confessing sin to God. It was a profound expression of humility to God. Who are Pharisees? Now, the Pharisees were the religious leaders of those ancient communities, setting the example for the people with their rituals, traditions, and way of life. They were strict in their adherence to all the rules and instrumental in making and adjusting those rules based on the accepted traditions. They set a standard for the people and were well respected. Loved by the people as leaders, the people looked up to them. Who were publicans? The publican is the tax collector. In opposition to the Pharisee, the tax collector was a man who was considered a traitor to the people. He had allied with the Romans in order to be able to collect taxes from the people and ultimately increase his own wealth in the process. The taxes kept being raised, forcing the people into poverty. But the tax collector's wealth would continue to increase. He was hated by the people. They despised him as a traitor and a lover of Rome. The Pharisee. Lifts himself up. The Pharisee was consumed with self. He was lifting himself up in his prayer to God, lifting himself up before man, despising his brothers, pointing out their shortcomings in public. He held himself above them and was condescending toward them, believing in his righteousness. Believes he's righteous. The Pharisee believed that he was a righteous man. He believed that by his strict observance of the rules, this elevated his standing before God. The Pharisee made the mistake of trusting in himself for his own righteousness with God. He felt somehow that he was better than others, that he was somehow more deserving of God's pleasure and approval. By his own acts, the Pharisee is setting himself apart from the others and believing the rest are somehow lesser than he. Keep away from sinners. The Pharisees made it a practice to keep themselves away from the sinners, to prevent the sin of another from somehow influencing them. They were of the belief that they were protecting their holiness. They were embracing the old covenant. But in this Pharisee's prayer, he was thanking God for how wonderful he was, how he had kept the law and tradition. He had not humbled himself before God. He was speaking as though he was on a more equal level with God than the others, and that his actions make him more worthy. Creates his own rules. In addition to these beliefs by the Pharisee, he has devised his own righteousness by methods he has made for himself. Not all that he is doing is in the law handed down from God. The traditions and rituals are being established by the Pharisees themselves. They have embellished the simple laws that have been given to them. He has created the path to what he thinks is his own holiness, and he is prideful in his execution of it. But is this form of worship pleasing to God? The lesson from the Pharisee. Jesus is warning us. The story of the Pharisee is meant as a warning. We must not be concerned with what others think of us. Stay focused on God. Stay focused on the purpose that God has for us, not the purpose we have for ourselves. Focused on what God thinks of us, making sure we have not elevated ourselves in our own pridefulness. Though we may feel that our compliance with what we believe is God's will makes us somehow in better standing with God, we must not make the mistake to believe that we are better than another. Our struggles to be righteous can be all-consuming. We must be cautious in how we hold ourselves in high esteem, believing somehow that this opinion is also the opinion of God. We must not lose sight of the purpose of our obedience to God. Pharisee was not justified. We note here that it was not the Pharisee who was justified in the eyes of God in this story. The Pharisee did not humble himself before God. He did not ask for forgiveness of sin. He merely thanked God for how wonderful he thought he was, and thanked God that he was not like the others. So because the Pharisee exalted himself, Jesus' teaching warns that he would be abased. He would be demoted in the eyes of God. Now he would be in a lesser standing with God for his pride. The tax collector. Humbling himself before God. Now the tax collector has distanced himself from others. He is in a place all alone, knowing that he is despised by the others, but that does not matter. He is immersed in his prayer to God. The tax collector has come emotionally naked to God. Without pride, he recognizes his sin and his weakness, never lifting his gaze to heaven. He keeps his eyes down, praying to God, acknowledging his sin and begging God for his mercy. He is asking God for forgiveness, beating his chest in his humility before God, absorbed in his guilt and his sorrow for his sin, not seeing or hearing anything else. He comes to God as a broken man. He is consumed. Requesting forgiveness. The tax collector realized something the Pharisee did not, that the mere ritual of religion is not enough to be close to God. That we have to admit that we are a sinner. We have to bring ourselves before God without pride, in complete simplicity, humble ourselves and ask for forgiveness of sin. Then and only then are we worthy to speak to God in prayer. Focus was seeking God. The tax collector's focus was on God, and it was in purity before God. In contrast to the Pharisee, he did not compare himself to others. He was focused solely on God and repentance for his sin. He was involved in seeking God, not seeking the approval of man. He came before God in humility and truth. This worship was pleasing to God. The lesson from the tax collector. Tax collector was justified. The tax collector was the one who was justified before God. We learned that it was the truth in his heart, in his worship, that was pleasing to God. The acts of religion are far less important. The observance of rules and traditions are just a step toward God. Without humility and a true heart, the religion alone is not pleasing to God, and we are not justified before God. With humility, we are exalted. But with acknowledgement that we are sinners, by taking responsibility for our sinful nature, we will attract the attention of God. And we must ask for forgiveness and mercy with a true heart. Worship and pray in humility before God. We can achieve justification in God's eyes, and God will be pleased. So Jesus teaches us that by being humbled before God, we are exalted, that our standing with God is elevated. That was a great lesson about the Pharisee and the tax collector. Be sure and hit subscribe. And I hope we'll see you over at the website at www.onfirecafe.net.